evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. My name is Jakub Orcsos. I'm the head of the programming team here, the programming arm of Brooklyn Public Library, BPL Presents. We are responsible for all the live events in the system, and our new venue, which you probably heard about, Center for Brooklyn History, the former Brooklyn Historical Society. So our team is producing events day in, day out. And why it's important to be here with you, first of all, it's amazing to see you in these huge numbers post-pandemic, is that, let's face it, we live in a maze. We found ourselves in a maze. I'm Hungarian. I grew up in a different country. Welcome. It's gonna be a bumpy ride, I promise. There's a reason for me to be here. So that's why we are really grateful for someone like Betty Kahn and Betty's family to help us and work with us and to help us to make this happen, to present a lecture which helps us potentially not finding any answers, but to be inspired and being able to look and brave enough to look into the eyes of the beast. That's why we are here. So there are people, with the help of the Betty Kahn and Betty and the Kahn family, who we can bring here and help us to navigate this maze. So, welcome. You'll be lost. You feel bad at some point, but we'll be here for you and with you throughout, I promise. And with this, let me bring Linda Johnson, the president of the library, to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Jakub. Well said. You know, we've long said that libraries are like the town square in every community, and what better use of a town square than to talk about the dilemmas that we're facing in our daily lives, and Lord knows there are enough of them. But I'm delighted to welcome you in particular to the 2022 Kahn Humanities Lecture, as Jakub said, made possible by Betty Kahn and her late husband, Steve, who so generally support our libraries and this endowed lecture series. I'm so happy to see a packed auditorium again, a reminder that after the past few years, some semblance of normalcy has returned to our branches. Our past year, especially the past few months, were unusually busy. The freedom to read, a core element of our right to free expression, has come under fire, succumbing to a political movement that has settled on censorship as a favored tactic. The rise of book bans has felt otherworldly. To date, in 2022, 137 bills have been introduced in 36 states to limit what books and curriculum can be taught, and there is no sign that the effort is slowing down. Here at Brooklyn Public Library, we've watched nervously as schools and libraries in neighboring states morphed into political battlegrounds. In April, we opened our collection to young adults directly affected by these book bans and by the political polarization. Through our Books Unbanned initiative, nearly 6,000 teens have received a free BPL digital card, and collectively, they have checked out over 43,000 titles. Needless to say, it's dismaying that the need for such a program exists. But the support that we've received from people like you for the Books Unbanned initiative has given me hope. And hope, specifically political hope, is what Masha Gessen is here to talk about this evening. Masha is a staff writer at The New Yorker and author of 11 award-winning books. Masha is also a distinguished writer in residence at Bard College and the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Nieman Fellowship, the Hitchens Prize, and the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Commentary. Masha's work is poignant and prophetic, often illuminating principle and social trends we alone can't bring ourselves to confront. After the lecture, Masha will be joined by Rabbi Rachel Timoner, who serves Congregation Beth Elohim. Together with New York City Council member Brad Lander, Rabbi Timoner established Get Organized Brooklyn, which is working to combat xenophobia, racism, and misogyny, and to strengthen ties among ethnic and faith communities. Please welcome Masha and welcome Rachel. I'm so grateful to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you. That's the famous 7-second delay. Wow. Thank you. I'm grateful to the Brooklyn Public Library, to the Kahn family, and particularly to Rachel Timoner for joining me tonight. And it's so interesting to be, first of all, what a room, but also it's so weird for me to be in a room where there's so many familiar faces. It's very exciting. So I am going to talk about political hope, but it will be a minute before I get to it. I'll start on February 24th, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I was a third of the way through writing a book on something called the parallel polis. A parallel polis was a concept pioneered by Czechoslovak dissidents, the culmination of a decade-long conversation with Polish dissidents. And the conversation was about political change and, in fact, political hope, and the possibility of political action in a totalitarian regime. How could you act politically in a society that had vanquished politics? How could you act when the smallest of steps, the mildest of protests, was punishable, when it exposed you to the risk of imprisonment or forced exile? The answer, they decided, was to do something else, to not be in direct confrontation with the regime, but rather to build a working model of the future in the present, so that when the totalitarian regime collapsed under its own weight, the thing you built would be there. And even if the regime didn't collapse, you would have lived a political life. On February 24th, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, all of my friends in Russia inhabited some sort of a parallel polis. Years earlier, they had been confronting the regime directly. Most of my friends had been journalists. They had also all joined and often helped organize protests. Then journalism and gradually what we would normally think of as protest became almost impossible. And the people I knew found ways to build better worlds inside a bad one. Instead of addressing audiences of tens, hundreds of thousands, they aimed to change the living conditions of 100, or 11, or one person at a time. It had taken me some time and effort to understand what they were doing, to understand what they were doing as politics. I had always thought of politics as an expansive process. My best friend, who's actually here, who had been a journalist, became a disability rights activist. She created a way to deinstitutionalize 11 kids with severe disabilities. Then one by one, several adults who had been held in psychiatric institutions. At first, all I could see was how much smaller her world had become. And then I realized that she and other activists and those kids, some of them nonverbal, and those adults who no one had ever listened to, were figuring out new ways to live in community. They were engaged in politics in its most direct sense. And I started to see this work as changing the world. And then on February 24th, the world changed. Russia unleashed a genocidal imperial war. A few weeks earlier, I had been in Ukraine, where friends had been telling me that the war was impossible. So when I came back and talk show hosts asked me if there was going to be a war, the Times was saying every day on the front page that there would be. Saying yes felt like a betrayal of my Ukrainian friends. I tried to explain what the question meant to me. I imagined the places the TV hosts were asking about. There had been a few days earlier eating something called Brooklyn pizza on the menu, in a restaurant with tin ceilings and antique chandeliers. And my friends there had been saying it wouldn't happen because they couldn't imagine it happening, because it was unimaginable. So I tried to say, you're asking me if that world will be destroyed, if the world will be destroyed. And when it felt like the world was destroyed, all my friends in Russia left, every single one of them. The leaving felt contagious. I'd go to someone's house to say goodbye. During that first week of the war, I was in Moscow. And someone else would be there, perplexed that the person was leaving, and then I'd see that person the next day, and they'd be getting ready to leave. It was like a relay race of leaving. And within a week, everyone I knew was gone. They gave reasons for leaving. There were rumors that the Kremlin would close the borders, that they would unleash full-scale terror, that they would institute a draft. But most of all, most honestly, the people I knew were leaving the country because they could no longer stand to be inside, as though they were inside a plane that was dropping bombs on Ukraine. They felt like they had to jump out of the plane. They'd jump out of their own skins if they could, because their skins were inside the monster. That whole idea that you could build a better society inside a terrible one, what did it mean now? Were they lending credibility to the regime? Were they painting the facade of the Kremlin while behind those walls plans for the war took shape? Were they literally making Russia that they could no longer think of as their country, Russia that had become synonymous with absolute evil, more livable? What does it mean to be inside? The book I was writing when the war began wasn't about Russia at all. Nor am I really talking about Russia now. We're only starting there because after February 24th, Russia has become peculiarly easy to talk about. It's so perfectly black and white now. Some of my friends left the inside of Russia to be on the inside of other countries like Israel. Those same people who wish they could jump out of their skin now have to develop a very thick skin. Some of them don't realize it yet, perhaps they never will, because Israel makes it particularly easy to not know what you're inside of. A couple of weeks ago, and the timing is important here, I was speaking to a Palestinian student of mine about their imagined audience, and I found myself saying, Palestine is a special case. Your otherwise well-educated, well-meaning reader may know nothing. In other words, your reader may have made the choice not to know what they're inside of. And now that burden is on you. I felt all right saying that in front of a group of students because, after all, I hadn't made that choice. I had informed myself. I'd gone on tours. I'd seen a couple of documentaries, read a few books, interviewed a dozen people. I spoke as though that placed me outside the structures that enabled the occupation. A week after that conversation, the results of the Israeli election came in. A few days after that, Prime Minister-designate Benjamin Netanyahu put forward the name of Itamar Ben-Gvir as the prospective head of the Interior Ministry. Today, Ben-Gvir appeared at a memorial celebration for Meir Kahane, a fascist. Ben-Gvir lives in Kiryat Arba, an illegal settlement in the West Bank. That wording has become so familiar that it has a way of playing into the willful blindness we exercise in relationship to Israel-Palestine. The place where the prospective head of the Israeli police lives is a locus of violence against Palestinians, a settler colonialist project. But what of those Israelis, new and old, who don't live in Kiryat Arba? Are they not inside that project? When I was making notes for this talk, I realized that I felt more confident bringing up the issue of Israel-Palestine than I ever have in a North American context. Because surely, after the election, after Ben-Gvir's attendance at the Kahane rally, which the Biden administration has already publicly condemned, this would be less controversial. And this makes me think about being inside not only space, but also time. When do we become the unwitting, often willingly unwitting, participants in a reprehensible project? How long have you been inside the thing? How long has the thing been the thing? I wrote a book about Putin in 2012, an article in 2008, a column in 2005. Does that place me inside or outside? I have been taken aback. Actually, I take that back. I have been driven absolutely crazy by the coverage of the midterm elections, which on this side of the political spectrum has been celebratory. The fact is that Democrats have probably lost the House and possibly lost the Senate. And what the commentariat and many of my friends who are not in the commentariat are celebrating is that the Republicans have less to celebrate than they'd hope. That they dealt the Democrats a loss instead of a crushing loss. I can explain why the media play the election that way. It has to do with capitalism mostly, with our having entrusted our entire public sphere to a few profit-making corporations, with their knowledge that racehorse coverage is cheap for the producer and addictive for the viewer. That's an easy enough story to tell, but it's not the whole story. The fact is that white people across states and economic strata overwhelmingly voted for an autocratic political party. The fact is that this autocratic party made use of decades and centuries-old tropes about crime and economic anxiety that feed primarily, if not solely, on racial anxiety. The fact is that a majority of white people, some of them fully consciously, some of them less so, voted for white supremacy. In the celebratory mood, the immense non-fact-based relief following the midterms, I think, is a measure of unwillingness to know that that is what we live inside of in this country. Many of my Russian friends are currently obsessed with issues of guilt and responsibility, with how you measure it and assign it, and how you carry it in the world. Sometimes when I tell my American friends about it, they look at me blankly. Americans don't carry around that kind of responsibility for their wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. Americans, who have many more ways of influencing their government than do Russians, are content to say, "Not in my name," and leave it at that. The good news is I'm not actually here to talk about how much guilt and responsibility we all have, how impossible it is to jump out of your skin. That would be too easy. I'm concerned with a much more difficult question, the same one that the dissidents grappled with 50 years ago. How do you act inside of it? This is why I asked a rabbi to be here with me. They're famous for holding two contradictory thoughts at one time. And what brought me to thinking about hope and wanting to write a book about political hope was the sheer amount of hopelessness that I look at every day in my work as a professor and as a parent. And I think we don't quite understand just how profound this hopelessness is among people who are in their teens and 20s right now. And how much that hopelessness has to do with what they realize we're inside of, which is a world that is in profound peril. In fact, a world that they believe, and maybe we should all believe, is ending. When we talk about the climate crisis, we lay blame or we reject blame, but when young people talk about the climate crisis, most of all, or even when they don't talk about it, actually, they're living with the possibility that they are the last generation. I think we don't understand just how unprepared, and maybe we couldn't possibly be prepared, but I know that all of Western thought has not prepared us to think about this possibility of being the last generation. And that has to do I mean, we assume that there's always a new beginning. We assume that there's always the possibility of renewal. When Hannah Arendt was writing about political hope, that was her basic assumption, right? That there was, that the fundamental reason for hope was the possibility of new beginnings and what she talked about as the ability of humans to invent something else, to invent something new. She also thought that hope was a moral obligation. And I think it's important to distinguish hope, as some great thinkers have done, from optimism. Right? Hope is not the condition of blindly believing that things will get better or somehow will fix themselves. It's not sitting back and waiting for something better to happen. It's not the very American habit of ending on a positive note, which I'm obviously doing a variation of. My favorite definition of hope comes from Erich Fromm, the great social psychologist, who wrote that a condition of hope is, and I love this phrase, the certainty of the reality of the possibility. And then brings me back to where I started. What I think he was talking about is that you have to prove that something is possible in order to hope that it is real, or you can, and that you also have to know what you're building that possibility inside of. A lot of things follow from that understanding, but perhaps the biggest one is uncertainty. And that's something that I'm grappling with in my writing, is how do you write a book that has no universal prescriptions, that has no right answers? How do you actually in life come to accept that you will never get to feel right? It's a very hard thing to do in activism and political organizing, actually. Every step you make to prove the reality of what's possible will also perhaps fortify the thing that you're inside of. And you don't have the luxury of dismissing it. And so you fail, and then you fail better, and you have to prove that failing better is possible, and you have to imagine so much more than you're used to imagining, and to ensure that the imagining isn't idle. And know that you may never, in fact, see the end of the bad thing that you're inside of, but the payoff is a life worth living inside your actual own skin. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I think there's going to be a chance for you to be able to ask some questions soon, but I get to start with the questions. First of all, Masha, thank you for removing any sense of joy we might have had from these midterms. So I want to make sure in our conversation we get to three things. I want to come back to three things that you said at least. I want to come back to like really kind of probing what kind of hope we could be nurturing and practicing. I want to talk about this parallel polis idea. And I want to talk about the idea of what we're inside of and kind of, are there limits to responsibility? And really, what I want to, maybe we'll start there. But because we come from a tradition that is a lot about responsibility. Abraham Joshua Heschel famously said, "Some are guilty, all are responsible." The Talmud teaches if there's wrongdoing in your family and you have the ability to protest and you do not, you are responsible. If there's wrongdoing in your city and you have the ability to protest and you do not, you are responsible. If there's wrongdoing in the whole world and you have the ability to protest and you do not, you are responsible. And you were talking about Russians, about Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, United States. And I wonder in this, and then climate, is there any limit? Like, how should we be understanding our responsibility in a way that is not hyperbolic, that is possibly conceivable, that has some amount of bounds to it, such that we can actually be responsible for that responsibility, and that isn't just a slogan, but is like actually that we could possibly be effective in being responsible. How do you think about that?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think you actually have so many answers in that question, right? You have to think about it in a way that's not debilitating. And again, there's no universal rule to how you go about doing it. Again, it's perhaps easiest for me to talk about Russians right now, in part because it's such a stark picture, but in part because there's actually something incredibly exciting going on that I've seen, which is there's a critical mass of people who have been shaken to the core. Many of the people that I was referring to at the beginning of my talk who thought that they were living good lives not as in living well, but sort of moral lives in an immoral place, and were so shocked by the war that had to reevaluate everything about, not only had to uproot themselves and their families and go elsewhere because they felt they had no choice, but they also had to rethink everything they thought they knew about the country where they had lived and what constituted their lives. And those are such productive moments, right, for people who are actually writing. Mostly writing. I'm sure people are doing other things as well. But what I'm seeing is writing in that state of being shaken to the core. Right? And I haven't. I'm lucky enough to have seen this kind of thing twice. The last time, I think, was in the late 80s in the Soviet Union, when people were confronted with things that they hadn't known or hadn't been exposed to on that scale about Stalinist terror. And they felt shaken to the core by this new knowledge about their past. And now they have new knowledge about their present, which is possibly even more productive. So I think that's one way, is you seize a moment when you're shaken.
And so when you're shaken, when you see clearly, because I think it's part of our reality that we accommodate ourselves to the conditions we find ourselves in, like continually, to try to be okay today. We're always accommodating ourselves and adjusting and normalizing things that shouldn't be normalized. And so there are moments when you just can't do that anymore, right? That's shaken to the core. And so then these friends that you talked about, they left. And I want to think with you a little bit about that, because it's like, how do we exercise responsibility? Now, I'm not going to sit here and have any idea of what what are the best choices for Russians to do in this situation. I have no comment on that at all. But what I'm thinking about is us living here. People fantasize here all the time, right, about Canada and whatever other countries people imagine. Maybe they even have dual citizenship and make sure they've got their passports and whatever. People think about this all the time here. And in particular lately, I think a lot of Jews have been really thinking about it not just as like, I don't like this government, I don't want to be part of this, but maybe this isn't a safe place for me. So I'm not minimizing any of that, but it seems to me like part of the question, the crux here is like, how do we exercise responsibility effectively? And is departure, when does that serve an important function? How does it help? Or how does it reduce harm? Does it reduce harm? When is staying the most important thing you can do? Because there is actually never a time that you're not inside. Even if you are physically outside, you're still inside. Are you ever not inside? How do we, what are you thinking about the question about staying, leaving, and how how do we effectively exercise responsibility when we realize, when we're shaken to the core and realize we're part of something that is immoral?
So I think there's actually a universal answer to that, and that's something that I thought about a lot when I first had to, when I second had to leave Russia, which was almost 9 years ago now, because the state threatened my family, and a lot of people. This was when the anti-gay laws were first passed, and so a lot of people were asking me, I'm invited to perform in Russia or speak in Russia. Should I go or should I boycott? And my answer was, well, you should, whatever you do, you should just do it in a way that counts, that you make it count. If you're going to go there, then you have to say something. If you're going to turn down the invitation, you also have to say something. Going and, turning down an invitation and being silent is just allowing someone else to take your place and perhaps be complicit. Going and saying nothing is also being complicit. So I think that actually applies quite universally. Whether you stay or go, you should probably do it in a way that makes it count. It gets easier in some ways the worse things get, right? Any male leaving Russia now makes it count because they can't be drafted, right? That's sort of an easy choice to make and an easy one to evaluate. It's much harder, I think, to evaluate, leaving the United States or leaving one state inside the United States and going to another, or registering to vote elsewhere, or whatever it is you do. I mean, I think that's that we have to apply the standard of does it count, and do you enable the bad less by leaving or by staying?
Mm-hmm. So in the project of staying, which is what I'm most interested in for, I hope, all of us, or you'll all make whatever choices you make in your life, but I would like to stay here. In the project of staying, the parallel polis, I think, is really interesting, and thinking about what are the places and ways that we build that here. As the rabbi of a congregation, I have this built-in community of people who gather regularly, and I often look around and I think about how few places there are in our society like that, where people are gathering regularly with each other. In particular, the people who gather where I am have a lot in common. There's diversity, but there's a lot in common. And there aren't, when I try to think about what are the places where there's just really a lot of diversity and people are gathering regularly, I think of schools in some cases. And there are just very few civic institutions anymore where people just gather. And that has been a conversation we've had for a while in this country. But I wonder where are you seeing in this country places where people are intentionally or just kind of naturally creating those alternative models?
So the idea of the parallel polis, I mean, again, this was an idea that came out of a totalitarian society. So there were some there's some very severe limitations on what was possible, and that led to some very clear ideas about what had to be done, right? And you're absolutely right. So the idea of the parallel polis is it includes some kind of difference, right? Some kind of diversity, because it's not about gathering with people who think just like you. It actually is about doing political work. So you have to have difference. But the idea that Václav Benda, a Czech philosopher and mathematician had when he wrote an essay called The Parallel Polis was that it had to function in some way that was clearly different from the way that the dominant society was functioning. Right? So it had to be culturally different, or economically different, or politically different, or religiously different. Right? But it had to be, in some very, very clear way, absolutely distinct. So I don't know that that everywhere in the United States, sort of that concept is applicable. Right? I think what's interesting is to look at the things that have broken down, right, and then figure out, is there a way to create an intentional, community, diverse project that functions differently in that way that has broken down, right?
To look for the gaps,
Exactly.
because those are opportunities. That's really interesting. I think that's an invitation. Okay, and that brings us to hope. So definitely for the Jewish people, hope is thought of as a moral obligation and even a kind of a discipline, and different than optimism as you described. And I actually, when you were talking, I was thinking about, we have a prayer we say called Mi Chamocha, which is the song that we sang when we crossed the sea to freedom. We had been enslaved for 400 years. There was no imagination of possibility of freedom. We were too long there, that when Moses came in the story, the people were kotzer ruach. They had crushed spirits. They couldn't even hear him. They couldn't even hear the idea that there was going to be freedom. And then here they were on the other side of the sea, free, and they break into song. And in that moment, that was spontaneous, and that was gratitude, and it was exaltation. But today, we sing that song twice a day, every day. What is that? That is saying, for our ancestors, the impossible became possible. We are determined to see what is possible here. And we are not going to forget that the impossible becomes possible. And so it's our job to look for the possibilities. And it is a way of not despairing, despair being a form of a cop-out, a form of an escape from reality. Whereas hope is engaging, different than optimism, engaging with reality and saying, even in this reality, I am determined to see possibility. So I wonder whether you think of, when you were talking about hope and political hope, whether you think of it as something that we can train ourselves toward, practice toward. What is it? What are examples you see? How do you think, how can we teach ourselves that?
I actually think that that's your job. So I'm going to turn that around on you.
Okay.
I mean, what do we say to young people? And that's, the project that I've been working on for several years. This book project is really an attempt to actually figure out what is possible to say. But to young people who don't just say, who really truly feel like we've gone and fucked up the world in every way possible, and now say to them, okay, and now it is your responsibility to have hope. When a lot of them deeply feel that they can't find it in themselves, right? And they don't see that possibility. Hard as that we might force them to try.
That's fair. And I before I said like despair is a cop-out, and honestly, despair is an emotion, and you can't control your emotions. And as a parent of two teens, it's hard to look out at this world and feel hopeful, and to have been given this world, it's hard to feel hopeful. I think that I was thinking about Viktor Frankl talking about like the last freedom that can't be taken away is the inner attitude, toward conditions that we're in. And I do think that it is, I guess, my job, but our job, can we say our job, to gently, like affirming where people are and their feelings, but then saying, this is something we have to learn how to do, because there is no other way forward except being determined that we will continue to look for and find possibility, even when it's bleak. There's a in this week's Torah portion, there's a woman named Hagar who's sent out into the desert, and her son is going to die, and there's no water, and she closes her eyes because she's giving up, because she just thinks she can't bear to watch him die. And then something makes her open her eyes, and she sees water she didn't see before by looking at her son. And like I think of that as like, we have to be willing to look at the impossible, and we have to be willing to keep looking and trying to see, where there might be a way. And so, yeah, I think even when you say, how do we look at our kids and say to them, like, you're supposed to be hopeful? I think there are ways to do that. That way of just, denying their reality, no. But acknowledging their reality and saying, and here we are, and what are we going to do about it? And we could just throw up our hands and do nothing, but for sure that will not get us where we want to go. So really, what is our alternative? We have got to insist on hope, and not that kind of fantasy hope, but that kind of, what is it? Certainty of the reality of the possibility. Yeah. So back to this idea, which we touched on, and I don't feel resolved with, which is this question about, when you were talking about the Russians who left because they felt that otherwise they were holding up, they were like painting the Kremlin, making it look good when it shouldn't look good. This idea that even our work to improve our own society and address its fundamental problems could be a way of being complicit, that is confusing to me. And I find it really hard to make the case that departure is better. And I wonder if you can reflect on that, would you, before you were saying, if you're gonna speak, if you're gonna go and speak, then you have got to say something. If you're not gonna go, you got to say something. But what I want to know is if we stay, given we're in a situation now where I don't think many of us are actually contemplating leaving, how do we do the work in a way that isn't about propping it up? Given that what you're saying is even work that is directly about addressing the fundamental problems could be about propping it up. What do you have to tell us?
Well, I think it is confusing. I think that knowing that it's confusing is actually the beginning of the project, and seeing the contradictory effects of good works, right? And sort of making complicated decisions about what kind of work is worth it, and what props it up too much. I think we have to grapple with it in all sorts of obvious and less obvious situations. And I think it also has probably something to do with dropping some of the questions that we're used to asking to measure the effectiveness of what we think of as good political work, like whether it's scalable, whether it's reproducible. I'm not convinced that things that are I am convinced that sort of applying those kinds of criteria actually obscures the complexity of any smaller project. Does that make sense?
It does, and the examples you gave about your friends, and the one by one kind of work that they were doing, I think is really important, because sometimes a single a single life changed or a single model, as small as it is and not replicable, can be exactly the idea we need for someday representing the polis that we're trying to, replacing the polis that we're trying to replace, or changing it. I've got questions. Do you want to say more?
No, I was just going to say that those are incredibly difficult thought habits to get rid of.
Yeah.
Right? And it's very hard to do something and not, or for me as a journalist to write about something and not think that this is, insignificant or this somehow counts less than the other thing, right?
Yeah. I think we're really good at writing off the things we do, or that's just me, but, where you can be hypercritical, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of the models we create and the experiments we try, and even just asking the questions that we ask. I think we shouldn't underestimate that. Okay, we have 5 questions here. Let's see what we can do. Can you address the idea of the privilege in leaving?
The privilege in leaving?
So, like, if you, maybe not everybody can get out,
Right.
or afford to relocate, or have access to it, and there's privilege there. Is there a way this is not on the card, but I'm just adding, is there a way that's like, abandoning people who cannot? That they didn't ask that, that's my addition, but.
No, there's always privilege in leaving, right? And I mean, you see that with the kind of leaving that I was describing, but it also, I like in the summer I was reporting on war crimes in Ukraine, and it was something that I realized probably should have thought of it sooner, but I only really grasped it in the process of reporting, just how much war crimes disproportionately affect the poor, because of course all the people with privilege had left. And so yeah, there's provision in leaving, and that has to enter into the equation. And that, we're starting to, I'm worried that we're kind of veering in this direction of saying that leaving is somehow morally suspect, which would be a very strange thing for me as a double immigrant, and as sometime refugee rights activist to say. Leaving is also like often a matter of survival, if not physical survival, then often psychic and mental survival. I think it's also incredibly generative. Like I think that and I think that's actually sort of there's this. I can't remember who wrote the essay. I think it was Czeslaw Milosz who wrote the essay in praise of exile. But it's basically the idea is that I think that when you land somewhere as an outsider, you have so much opportunity to see what is strange and what has been normalized in a society that ought not be normalized, right? And I think it's no accident that so much political theory and like great political thought comes from exiles, because there are people who, when thinking about politics and thinking about political life, are most capable of estrangement. So just to shift the focus a little bit.
So important, and probably most of us are descendants of people who left somewhere, and many of us from people who left many somewheres. Yeah. The New York Times is reporting that Biden is encouraging Zelensky to be open to negotiating. I think that is a fool's errand. You need to believe Putin as a negotiating partner will cede a weakness. Where are you on this?
I think I don't know that I believe that Biden is encouraging Zelensky to negotiate. So that's, but I've been afraid of that. I've been afraid that at some point, probably around this point of November, December, Western Europeans in particular were going to start demanding that Ukraine start negotiating. And And you really have to understand what negotiating means, right? It's not so much a question of it being a fool's errand as what is anybody who proposes to Ukrainians that they should negotiate with Russians is basically saying, consider how many Ukrainians should live under Russian occupation. Right? When we know exactly what Russian occupation looks like. Right? No occupation, I think, certainly not in this amount of time, has been documented the way that Russian occupation of Ukraine has been documented. The mass graves, the torture chambers, the forced transfer of people, that is something to negotiate about. That somebody is actually going to say to Ukrainians, some of your people should live in those conditions. That's the non-starter. It's not that Putin is not a reliable negotiating partner, which is obviously true, right? But it's the very premise that that something on that land at this point can be negotiated.
Thank you. Could you address the low level of public discussion of current events? For example, inflation is never revealed to be the result of aggressive and irresponsible tax cuts, but historic and pertinent facts seem forgotten.
Well, it's not never revealed, right? But I mean, I can go on about American media at length. We definitely have the most vibrant and wealthy media in the world, and it's terrible. It is intentionally dumb. It is intentionally simplified. It is, and the problem with it. I mean, we can talk about the specific problems, the racehorse coverage that I was talking about before, the incredibly sort of stable, distracting narratives. For example, the narrative on inflation as as a factor in political campaigning and nothing else. Which is also part of racehorse coverage. I mean, that's none of that is the problem. The problem is that we've outsourced the public sphere to a few profit-making corporations, and appealing to them to self-regulate better is a fool's errand. Right? We have to rethink how we organize public discussion in this country, and whether we think of media as a byproduct of advertising or an actual public service. And if it's an actual public service, then it should be regulated and constituted as a public utility. We should pay for it with taxpayer money, and we should regulate it the way we would regulate a public utility. And if we want profit-making corporations to do a somewhat better job, I mean, that's a variety of optimism. That's not even hope, because there's no certainty of the reality of the possibility there.
Well done. Well done. Before I go to the next question, I'm thinking about back to this idea when you were saying about that we shouldn't kind of cast aspersion on those who leave, and about the ways that exiles bring a non-normalization lens to the things because it's fresh to them, and whether it might not be that the way that we, for now, hold both of those ideas, as you were asking me to be a person who could bring two contradictory ideas, is to be thinking of ourselves as both at the same time. That we think about the ways that from inside we can be creating this polis, this alternative way of living, and be building that system, while also be keeping ourselves enough in touch with exiles and with those who are on the outside to be non-normalizing. I mean, that's actually that combined posture, that kind of simultaneous building up the future while taking down the veil from what has become normal to us, to be trying to get to that shaken place, is perhaps what this moment calls us to do. Okay. That's established. Okay, great.
I can consider it better myself.
Thank you so much, Masha. I'm a journalist, and I'm a huge fan of your work. One thing I feel extremely frustrated about is the left's reluctance to call out the right for its fascist behavior, But when it does, the right goes into denial and crafts a false equivalence of leftist extremism / communism. How do we get people to see with clarity? How do we as a country learn to call a spade a spade?
Yeah, I don't know that I agree fully with that analysis, but so I'm just going to answer the question that I want to answer, which is I think this actually tries to get at, which is the problem of imagination, what Martin Buber called imagining the real, right? And I think there's a, I think you talked about normalization earlier and how we always adapt, and we have a deep need to adapt, and we have to keep telling ourselves that it's not the end of the world, or that the world hasn't ended, which actually is empirically confirmed every day because the world hasn't ended yet. And so, but I think specifically when it has to do with fascism, we get into this argument about whether something is classic fascism or, comparable to Nazi Germany level fascism. And, I think it was starkest actually when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez compared detention centers to concentration camps, and there was this incredible outpouring of outrage that tapped into something I think very deep-rooted, which is that we've imagined some things as impossible. Right, we've imagined some things as unimaginable, as something that can't possibly be happening to us here. It can't possibly be, in particular, I think, carried out by people who appear to us to be perfectly human, just like us, right? And so if this thing, right, if this really huge, scary word like fascism applies to the unimaginable realm, and something is actually happening, then those can't possibly be the same thing, right? And I think we actually have to do the work of reconciling those and address that sort of imaginable, unimaginable divide head on.
It's really important and also devastating. And I wonder, part of what we're talking about is the kind of the human need to be soothed and to be sometimes feel like it's okay. And it makes me think about this rhythm that we have in the Jewish calendar, where every 7 days we take a day and live as if the world is exactly how it should be. I mean, that's what Shabbat is supposed to be. You're supposed to pretend that and notice all the things that are good as they are, the beautiful sky, the tree, whatever. Notice that you're alive, that you're breathing, that you have love in you, that like all the things that are as they should be, so that you've filled up, so that the other 6 days you plunge back into the world as it is, and the kind of taking down all the veneer we put up to in general be in denial. That you perhaps have more capacity to take down your denial if you give yourself a break every now and then, and fill yourself up with all the things that are just good and blessings and causes for gratitude. And that's one way that a people has figured out over time how to stay in it. But I wonder if that idea, that larger idea, might be of use to us as we need to face the things that we lie to ourselves about, because we need to feel okay sometimes. I don't know what you think about that.
I've never heard Shabbat explained that way. That's so useful.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea is that the idea is that there's Olam Haba, the world to come, which is like a world that's characterized by peace and justice someday, but that it doesn't just come. We have to get there. I guess it depends what kind of Jew you are. There's different ways of interpreting that. But in my world, we have to get there, and so, but that if we don't ever take a day, so Shabbat is supposed to be a taste of the world to come, a taste of the world as filled with peace and justice. So you take a day as if that's already so, and just enjoy being alive and rest from all of the rest. And then 6 days you plunge back into the responsibility, which, you know, as the Talmud tells us, anything in the entire world that that you don't protest, that you have the ability to protest, that's wrong in the world, you are responsible for. There's like no limit. Back to that question of limits of responsibility, which we already took. But I have one more question from you for another topic. Okay. What do you make of Putin's announcement that he's withdrawing from Kherson? And I pronounced that wrong, I'm certain.
No, you pronounced that very well.
Oh, good.
They appear to be withdrawing from Kherson. I have a deep dislike for conspiracy thinking, even in the presence of conspiracies. Right? I think that when we're observing that the Russian army is withdrawing from Kherson, and when the Russian Ministry of Defense has said that they're withdrawing from Kherson, and there's no indication that anything other than that is happening, I would think that that's what's happening, and that's a fact-based reality to engage with, rather than to look for unrevealed secrets, which I think are ways to actually become distracted from from living in reality. So.
Well, we have, I believe, come to the end of our time, and I just want to thank you so much for teaching us all the time. We all benefit from your teaching, and I'm so grateful for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.